Your house is perfect for my parents, Brad said, smiling like he owned the place. They're moving in tomorrow. The words hit harder than a hammer. I didn't flinch. I just set my coffee cup down, slow and steady, the porcelain touching the saucer with a soft click that filled the silence. Tomorrow? I said quietly. You move fast. He laughed, too sure of himself. Sarah looked down, her fingers tightening around the edge of her plate. She didn't say a word. And that silence, her silence, hurt more than anything he said. 3 days later, when he showed up with a moving truck and that same smug grin, he froze. Police lights flashed against the walls he thought he'd take over. The man who spoke like a conqueror suddenly had nothing to say. That was the day he learned. Never mistake quiet for weakness. Stay with me until the end. You won't believe what I did next. Something so precise, so legal, it left them speechless. Before we move forward, please subscribe to the channel and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. I'd love to know how far it goes. My name is Ellis Cunningham. I'm 61, a retired school principal living in Willow Creek, Colorado. This house, 3 bedrooms, a little garden, and a creaky old floor, has been my home for over 30 years. I built it with my wife, Ann. We filled it with coffee mornings, apple pie on Sundays, and the kind of laughter that makes a house feel alive. That May afternoon began with sunlight through the window and the smell of jasmine in the yard. I didn't know then that by sunset one sentence would change everything I thought I knew about peace, family, and trust. The late May sunlight poured through the wide window, warm and honeyed, laying itself across the oak table like a blessing I didn't ask for. The air carried the faint bitterness of roasted Sumatra mandling beans and the clean scent of freshly cut grass drifting through the screen door. I leaned back in my cracked leather armchair, the one that sighed every time I did, and listened to the slow hum of the ceiling fan above. Outside, the wind rustled the jasmine fence Ann had planted decades ago. Her touch still lived in that garden. Inside, the clock ticked steady, 3:47 p.m., a sound that usually soothed me. Not today. The bell rang once. 2 figures framed in the doorway. Sarah, my daughter, her hair tied up like her mother used to, holding an apple pie still steaming from the oven. The scent of cinnamon and sugar wrapped the room like an old lullaby. And behind her, Brad, polished, confident. The white shirt, no wrinkles. The grin, too wide. The eyes, sharp as broken glass. They stepped inside. Sarah placed the pie on the counter, her wedding ring glinting in the amber light. Brad scanned the room like a buyer touring a property. His gaze stopped at the framed photo of Ann and me, smiling, back when the world was kinder. Mr. Ellis, Brad said, brushing imaginary dust off his cuff. You know, this place, it's perfect for my parents. They'll be moving in tomorrow. The sentence dropped like a brick into still water. I froze mid-sip. The spoon hit the saucer with a soft metallic ring that hung in the air longer than it should have. Tomorrow? I asked, setting the cup down. That's quite sudden, isn't it? He smiled wider, all teeth, no warmth. They need a peaceful space, big windows, quiet street. Your house is perfect. And well, you're not exactly using all this space. Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. Dad, please don't be upset. We just thought you might like company. You've been alone too long. I looked at her. She couldn't hold my eyes. That hurt more than the words themselves. I forced a smile, small, precise, cutting through the air like the edge of a blade. Company, I said softly. That's thoughtful. Brad relaxed, thinking the storm had passed. He poured himself coffee without asking, stirring sugar like he owned the place. The sound grated against porcelain. You could move somewhere smaller, he continued, tapping his phone. A 1-bedroom in town, low maintenance. I could even help you list this place. Current market value, $900,000, maybe more. It'd be a smart move. I let him talk, let the arrogance roll through the room. The house seemed to tighten around us, the wooden beams remembering every word. Sarah pretended to fix the napkins. Her hands trembled slightly. Brad, she whispered, maybe this isn't the right time. He ignored her. Look, I'm just being practical. It's a big house for one man. Wouldn't it be better if someone actually used it? I stood, slow and deliberate, the leather creaking beneath me. The evening light caught the dust, turning it gold. Someone does, I said quietly. He looked confused. What? Someone uses it, I repeated. Every memory in these walls, every laugh, every fight, that's use enough. He chuckled, the sound hollow. You can't live off memories, Mr. Ellis. Maybe not, I said, but you can die without them. The clock struck 4. The air felt heavier, the way it does before rain. Sarah turned away, wiping her eyes. I picked up the cold coffee again, staring at the dark surface. I thought about Anne, how she used to hum while dusting the piano, how her laughter once filled this same room. Now silence reigned, and silence, I realized, could be louder than thunder. Brad adjusted his cufflinks. Anyway, just wanted to let you know. They'll arrive around noon tomorrow. We'll handle everything. I nodded, expression unreadable. I'm sure you will. He grinned again, missing the weight in my voice. Sarah kissed my cheek, her lips cold. Then they left, the screen door slamming softly behind them. For a long time I didn't move. The ticking clock felt louder now, the air still. Outside, the sky dimmed from gold to gray. The scent of jasmine thickened, clinging to the curtains. I whispered to the empty room, I can't tell which cut deeper, their plan or her silence. The wind shifted, brushing against the window pane like fingertips. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled. And I knew, as sure as I knew my own name, this summer wouldn't be peaceful. It would be a war. I started paying attention. Little things, the kind that hide in daylight. Brad began dropping by to check a few renovation sketches, always with a tape measure and that realtor gait like he owned every square foot he stepped on. Sarah avoided my eyes at dinner. Their talk circled the same drain. Inventory is tight. Prices up 12% year over year. Perfect time to sell in our zip. The house listened with me. The beams creaked when he bragged. The old clock answered with a slow, stubborn tick, like a mule that refused to move. He said he still had contacts at a small brokerage on Larimer Street, Larimer Ridge Realty, a modest second-floor office above a coffee shop that smells like burnt caramel. One afternoon, his vest pocket spit out a folded credit card statement when he hung his jacket. Balance past due, $47,000. Late fee, $89. APR that could choke a bull. Their 2021 Lexus was still under finance. I'd seen the payment notice, $600 due on the 15th. They smiled a lot for people underwater. Brad, I asked casually, you think this roof is old? Very, he said, eyes tracing the rafters. If you replace it, comps jump. Minimum value add, $150. $150,000? He nodded. Easy, I've got a guy. Shingles, gutters, the works. Sarah whispered, maybe don't push, Brad. He kept going, tapping notes into his phone like the house was a spreadsheet. Square footage like this on a corner lot, it's a gold mine. And whose mine is it? I asked. Silence. He smiled, sails bright. I watched the late sun turn the floorboards brass. I'd kept every bill in a shoebox. County tax, $4,862 last year. Roof estimate from a contractor, $18,500. Furnace service, $289. Numbers with edges. Real things you can bruise a hand on. Brad spoke in helium numbers. Light, floating, untethered to labor or memory. Sarah set the table, her fingers trembling when the knife touched the plate. He wandered to the hallway gallery. You could take these down for a clean show, he said, chin toward the photos. Anne in a denim jacket, Sarah missing 2 front teeth, my hand on a wobbly backyard fence I swore I'd fix and never did. Buyers like a blank canvas. Buyers, I said, tasting the word like metal. Don't you want less to take care of? I take care of what matters, I said. He laughed softly. You can't mow memories, Mr. Cunningham. No, I said, but they're the only thing that grows without permission. I walked the perimeter that evening like a sentry. The singed mark on the kitchen counter where Anne once set a too-hot pot. The scuff near the piano from Sarah's first high heels. The window latch that sticks in November. The jasmine hedge breathed sweetness into the cooling air. If a house is a body, these were its scars, earned, not for sale. I stood under the eaves and listened to traffic on Willow Creek Road, tires on asphalt, a distant siren, a dog bark timing its life by passing cars. Inside, Brad flipped through ideas. We knocked this wall, open concept. Staging on Thursday, showing Saturday, offers by Monday. I can push it to my list. Your list? Qualified buyers, we'll get above asking. Sarah said, Brad, please. He didn't stop. You could rent in Cherry Creek, 1 bedroom, elevator, close to everything. $2,000 a month, maybe less with a senior discount. And what does peace cost? I asked. He blinked. Peace? The kind you don't have to finance. He pocketed the statement without looking at it. I picked it up and placed it on the table between us. The paper made a dry, papery sound, like brittle leaves. "Your numbers are not my future," I said. He stared at the total as if staring could change it. Sarah carried in the pie, cinnamon and butter reaching for our throats with warm hands that felt like history. I poured coffee. The spoon rang again. The jasmine pushed through the screen. The clock ticked. I could feel the season turning on its hinge. Was I watching a family drift into a transaction, or a transaction devour a family? The air felt thinner, like altitude stealing breath from a climber who misjudged the mountain. If tomorrow brings a clipboard and a moving truck, what will I be asked to sign away? Square footage or the last unbroken corner of my life? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow, and I truly appreciate it. Dinner should have smelled like peace, roast meat, garlic butter, wine, breathing in the open air. But that night it carried something else, a faint metallic scent of tension, the kind that hums right before lightning strikes. Sarah tried too hard to smile. My daughter once laughed without measure. Now her words came measured, careful, trimmed to avoid sparks. Brad carved the roast, his movements precise. He poured red wine, a $39 Merlot I'd saved since Anne's last birthday, and filled his own glass first. The cork sat on the table like a small, dead thing. He looked up at me, grin polite, voice soft as silk on the edge of a knife. "You should take it easy, Mr. Ellis," he said. "Go somewhere warm, Florida maybe. A smaller place, less to maintain." I took a sip of water, not wine. "Smaller?" I asked. "Or not mine at all?" The clink of metal on porcelain answered for him. Sarah had dropped her knife. The sound rang in the air, sharp, high, final. "Dad, don't," she whispered. "We're just trying—" "To do what's best for me?" I cut in. I've heard that line before. No one moved. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. Brad shifted in his chair, that same smirk flickering for half a second before he masked it. "Don't take it the wrong way," he said lightly. "We're thinking of your comfort." "Comfort," I repeated, leaning back. "Is that what you call taking a man's roof while he's still under it?" He exhaled through his nose, the way people do when patience runs thin. "That's not fair, sir. We're family." The word family landed like ash. Sarah reached across the table, her hand trembling. "Please, both of you, stop." I pushed my chair back and stood. The air felt too small, too heavy. The rain had started outside, soft at first, then steadier. I opened the window. Cold air swept in, carrying the smell of wet pavement and jasmine. Brad's reflection appeared beside mine in the glass, his shape blurred by the raindrops sliding down. For a moment I saw us both, the old and the new, the keeper and the taker. He said quietly, "You can't hold on to everything forever, Ellis. That's not how life works." I turned, voice low but clear. "Life doesn't work by selling what can't be replaced." He shrugged. "Sometimes you have to let go." "Sometimes," I said, "you fight for what's left." The room went still again. Sarah's eyes filled, but she said nothing. The storm outside hit harder, rain drumming on the metal roof, thunder rolling from the mountains like an ancient argument reborn. Brad lifted his glass, breaking the silence with a casual toast. "To change," he said, "and to family." I didn't raise mine. He drank alone. The wine left a dark ring on the linen tablecloth shaped like a small red wound. I stared at it while the thunder faded into a whisper, wondering how long it takes for something sacred to rot once you let greed inside. That night, after they left, I washed the dishes myself. The sink water ran warm, steam curling upward, fogging the window. Outside, the jasmine bent under the rain. Inside, the air carried a strange quiet, the kind that comes not from peace, but from what breaks before war begins. The house listened. Every creak and sigh of the wood seemed to ask the same thing I was asking myself. Was this the last meal I'd ever share with my daughter as her father, or the first where she saw me only as an obstacle to remove? That night the house felt heavier, as if it, too, understood what had been said and could no longer breathe the same air. The rain had thinned to a drizzle, tapping the windows in slow, uneven rhythms. I sat by the fireplace, the only light flickering orange against the walls. The logs cracked softly, tiny bursts of sound that reminded me of the way Anne used to laugh when she burned the toast and pretended it was on purpose. Her picture sat on the mantel, smiling, forever caught in that April afternoon sunlight from years ago. I poured a small glass of whiskey, not to forget, but to slow the ache. The bottle was half empty, the kind of detail she would have noticed and teased me about. On the coffee table lay a folded letter, the one I'd written to Sarah the week she married Brad. The paper had yellowed at the edges. The ink bled faintly where I'd signed it. Love you always, Dad. I ran my thumb across the words, wondering when exactly always had become negotiable. The wind outside found its voice again. It pushed through the branches of the old oak in the yard, the same one Sarah used to climb. The creaking sounded like whispering ghosts, all speaking in Anne's tone. I closed my eyes. For a moment I could almost feel her hand on my shoulder, that gentle squeeze she used whenever silence grew too loud. Where had I gone wrong? Was it when I taught Sarah that home was a safe place, that love could hold even the heaviest weight? Or when I believed integrity could survive in people who'd never had to earn it? The whiskey didn't answer, only warmed my throat and deepened the questions. The phone rang, sudden and sharp, slicing through the quiet. I picked it up, expecting a wrong number. "Mr. Cunningham?" a polite voice asked. "This is Melissa from Northgate Bank. I just wanted to verify something." My hand tightened around the receiver. "Go ahead." "We received an inquiry today regarding the power of attorney for your property," she said. "Someone asked if you had an active authorization on file." My stomach turned cold. Who asked? The pause was short, professional, merciless. "A Mr. Brad Miller. He identified himself as your son-in-law." Silence filled the line. I could hear the faint tapping of a keyboard on her end, the muffled hum of air conditioning. "Thank you," I said finally. That'll be all." "Of course, sir. Have a good evening." The call clicked dead. I set the phone down, staring at it as if it were a weapon still smoking. My hands trembled. The fire popped again, louder this time, a spark jumping onto the hearth before dying. Brad had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Curiosity was one thing. Legal inquiry was war. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling beams. They'd held through blizzards, hailstorms, termites, everything life could throw. Could they hold through betrayal? The old mantel clock ticked past 10:37 p.m. Its pendulum swung steady, unaware it was counting down to something breaking. In the dim light, Anne's photo caught the fire's reflection, and for a split second it looked as if her eyes were moving, watching, warning. I lifted the glass toward her picture. "You were right," I murmured. "Kindness without caution is just an invitation." The whiskey tasted bitter now. I set it down beside the letter, the ring of condensation slowly staining the paper. The storm had stopped outside, but the air still carried that charged silence after thunder, when the world holds its breath, waiting to see what survived the strike. I went to the window and looked out across the yard. The streetlights threw long, trembling shadows of the oak tree across the lawn. It looked like the veins of something old and still alive, something not yet willing to die. Somewhere down the block a dog barked once, then stopped. The world was still again, except for my pulse. I turned from the glass and stared at the phone. My reflection in the dark window stared back. A tired man in his 60s with the look of someone who just realized love can be used as a signature on a contract. How do you defend yourself from family? Not with fists, not with rage, with proof, with patience, with silence sharpened into something that cuts clean. I went to my study and opened the drawer where I kept Anne's old fountain pen, the one that still smelled faintly of ink and cedar. I uncapped it and set it beside a blank notepad. The firelight flickered across the page. If Brad wanted a war of paperwork, he'd get one. But it would be a war fought by a man who had nothing left to lose, and that's a kind of man worth fearing. Outside, the last drop of rain slid down the window pane and disappeared into the earth. Inside, I whispered to no one, "Tomorrow, I stop being the father they think they can manage." And in that whisper, I felt something shift, not grief this time, but resolve. Before we move forward, please subscribe to the channel and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. I'd love to know how far it goes. I went to Harding & Cole LLP the next morning, the building at 2047 Broadway looming like a piece of the city itself. The elevators sighed up 3 floors. The waiting room smelled of cheap coffee and older magazines, the kind of place where old cases and older clients cross paths. Harding stood when she saw me, hair threaded with silver, black frames resting low on her nose, eyes that had handled more than a few family tragedies and still kept a sensible humor. "Ellis," she said, and it wasn't surprise in her voice so much as confirmation. "I'm afraid you were right. Brad has reached out to another firm. They've filed papers asking for guardianship of an elderly adult. Guardianship? I repeated, tasting the word like bitter medicine. Yes, they want to claim you lack capacity. Once they have that, selling your property becomes straightforward. They can petition the court, get temporary control, and move assets. It's a legal route to flipping a house without the owner's consent. The walls felt closer. I ran a hand over my face and tasted the stale coffee in the air. If this is their game, I said, then fine, we'll play, by my rules. She opened a folder like a surgeon opening a chart. Paper slid. Titles, dates, deeds, signatures, insurance declarations. You've been meticulous, she said, flipping through a stack of bills and certificates we'd kept together for years. Deed is clean. You executed an irrevocable trust 5 years ago. Good move, but they can still file for emergency guardianship if they convince a judge you're at risk. I felt a cold knot form behind my breastbone. Emergency guardianship? How fast can that move? Fast enough to be dangerous, she said. They'll need a physician's affidavit saying you lack capacity, or they'll argue neglect. We need to anticipate medical evaluations, court filings, motions, temporary restraining orders. We need evidence not just of your clarity, but of their intent. We set a plan. First, secure accounts, freeze any changes, notify banks, alert the county recorder's office. Second, document everything: calls, visits, transactions. Third, gather witnesses, neighbors, friends, anyone who can vouch for my competence and daily routine. Fourth, prepare for the inevitable: depositions, subpoenas, possible criminal referrals if fraud appears. She called her paralegal, who pulled a list: Denver Adult Protective Services, the county probate calendar, the local clerk of court, the on-call magistrate. She read the numbers: phone lines, case numbers, addresses. 1432 County Center Drive, Probate Division. 1101 Federal Street, Adult Protective Services. Each coordinate felt like placing chess pieces on a map. Have you ever hired a guardian? She asked. No, I said. I hired a gardener once, different kind of trust. Harding smiled briefly, then grew serious. We'll document everything. You'll need to go in for a cognitive evaluation. It's public record, yes, but it will serve as a baseline. A Mokier test, neuro eval, get the score on the record. 26 or above is solid. We'll also install a simple log for daily activities: meds taken, meals, payments I make. We'll put together a calendar with timestamps, grocery receipts, gas station charges, library checkouts. The mundane things are our allies. They prove life is lived, not fabricated. We discuss timelines. Brad's firm could file within days. Judges sometimes issue temporary orders within 24 to 48 hours if a physician signs off. That worried me most, the speed. Harding looked at me and said, "You should be calm, but you should also be ready. Control the narrative before they can." We left the office carrying a short stack of to-do items and a larger pile of intent. The city felt the same: cars, vendors, the soft hiss of a bus. But I noticed the details now. The slope of the sidewalk at the corner of 18th and Broadway, the way the sun hit the courthouse steps at 10 a.m. I noticed the numbers of life like a man who counts his remaining coins. Back at home, I called Northgate Bank and placed a fraud alert on my account. I asked for transaction histories for the past 6 months and set 2-factor authentication. The bank sent an email with a case number, NB8421113, and a promise to flag unusual activity. I faxed copies of the trust document to Harding's office and scanned invoices from the last 12 months. Furnace servicing, $289 on Nova 12. Roof inspection, $420 on March 2nd. County tax payment, $4,862 received April 1st. The more mundane, the better. Receipts that stitch a life into proof. That afternoon, I put a small audio recorder in the kitchen drawer where Brad kept his business cards. It felt sordid and necessary, like hiding a stone in a pocket before a thrown fight. I told myself it was for proof. I told myself I wasn't becoming someone I hated, but truth is a mirror that sometimes shows a stranger willing to do what must be done. Harding scheduled a medical evaluation at St. Luke's Memory Clinic, an intake at 9 o'clock a.m. the following morning. We'll have the report in 3 to 5 business days, she said. If Brad files before then, we'll file our response, submit your baseline, and ask the court to deny emergency guardianship pending a full evaluation. I thought about strategy like a retired architect measuring a house, wall by wall, plan by plan. You study vulnerabilities the way you'd study load-bearing beams. You shore up the weaknesses before anyone notices the cracks. I knew where to place supports. I knew where to nail the boards. Sarah called that evening. Her voice sounded small over the phone. "I'm sorry," she said. She stopped. "I don't know what to do." Her confession unspooled like thin thread. "You don't have to decide tonight," I said, "but if you choose to help, you choose to be honest. No more half-truths." She promised to think about it. I ended the call and sat at the kitchen table, the recorder ticking like a tiny, patient clock. The house hummed with ordinary noises. The fridge, a distant lawn mower, a squirrel on the porch. But underneath, a new current ran. Legal electricity, sharp and bright. I wrote down everything we'd discussed, bank numbers, hotline names, the steps Harding advised. The list grew long and precise. It gave shape to chaos. It gave me something to do. As night fell, I stood by the window and watched my street, the lamplights, the stray newspaper, a couple walking their dog. My reflection in the glass looked older and steadier than I felt. I tasted iron in my mouth and thought of Anne's handwriting on that old letter. She had always told me to be practical, to keep my affairs in order. I had followed that advice without drama. I had not expected my own family to become the threat. If war is letters and affidavits and bank alerts, then I was ready to fight. If war is the slow erosion of trust, then I would rebuild with concrete and file stamps. Was I still the kind man who left cookies for the neighborhood kids? Or was I becoming a man who read legal codes like scripture, prepared to protect what little remained? 3 days later, I played dumb. Sunshine on the porch, sprinklers hissing across the lawn, the smell of wet earth and fresh coffee. Brad and Sarah arrived laughing too brightly, like actors who had memorized the scene but not the truth behind it. I ground a new bag of beans, let the kitchen fill with the chocolate dark aroma, and set 3 mugs on the oak counter. "Dad, when are you moving into assisted living?" Brad asked, casual as weather. "I found a great place in Highlands Ranch, Willow Heights Care. Full activities, memory support if needed." "Oh," I said, pouring. "How much a month?" "Only about 5,000. I'll handle the paperwork." I let the steam fog my glasses. "You're generous, Brad, but you seem to have forgotten. I'm still healthy." His smile thinned. A bead of sweat gathered at his temple, though the house was cool. He lifted the mug, burned his tongue, and winced. "Don't take it the wrong way," he said. "It's about convenience. Safety." "For whom?" I asked. "For everyone." Sarah touched his arm. "Brad, stop pushing." He squeezed her fingers without looking. "I'm not pushing. I'm planning." We moved to the breakfast nook. Sunlight pooled on the table like liquid brass. Brad opened his notes app, tapped quick as a telegraph. He talked square footage, HOA bylaws. A handy man he knew who owed him a favor. My house became bullet points. "You've got unused equity," he said. "Don't let it rot in these walls." "These walls," I answered, "are where my life happened." He shrugged. "Life can happen anywhere." "Not mine," I said. They stayed an hour touring the rooms I didn't invite them to. In the hallway, Brad measured the width between door jambs as if a stretcher might pass through. I watched his tape click shut like a metal tongue. Sarah paused at Anne's photo and blinked quickly, as if dust had jumped into her eyes. When they left, I breathed again. The silence felt medicinal. I washed their cups and watched coffee run down the sink, dark, brief, gone. The house smelled of jasmine, detergent, and the faint electric smell of a day that plans to storm. That night I began my part of the game. I slid a thumb-sized recorder into the shadowed space behind the spice rack. Nutmeg, cumin, a little glass jar labeled Anne's Mix. The device glowed once, then slept. Another went under the lip of the hall table, the one that always wobbled because I refused to fix the leg Anne chipped moving it in 1998. The house would listen with me. I stood in the kitchen, lights off, and practiced silence. The refrigerator hummed, the water heater knocked. Far away a train horn pulled a thin line across the night. I wrote the day's events in a small black notebook. 4:12 p.m., visitors. 4:28 p.m., pricing talk. 4:51 p.m., sweat at his temple. 5:07 p.m., measuring hall. Ordinary stamps of time, proof that breath had not abandoned this address. An hour later, my phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number linking a glossy brochure. Willow Heights, senior living with dignity. Smiling actors on benches, watered lawns. The caption promised seamless transitions. I typed back, no, then deleted it and typed nothing. Silence is a better witness. I brewed chamomile and sat by the back door. The night carried crickets and the low rush of traffic on Willow Creek Road. Porch light moths battered themselves against a circle they could not understand. I felt for Anne's ring in my pocket, a habit when I needed gravity, and closed my fist around it until the gold warmed my skin. The next afternoon they returned with takeout, paper bags that smelled of sesame and cheap soy. They moved through my kitchen like renters who had already signed. Brad spoke in a stage whisper, as if secrecy equals power. Paperwork is easy, he said. Medical forms, a letter from a physician, a quick court date. We'll get guardianship in no time. You need proof I can't manage, I said. He smiled without humor. Everyone has bad days. Mine are numbered, I said, and I know how to count. Sarah's voice trembled. Brad, please. He turned to her. We can't afford to wait. The market's hot. Market's cool, I said. Houses heal slower. He set the takeout boxes down too hard. Noodles jumped. The lid clattered like cheap cymbals. You're being unreasonable, he said. I'm being resident, I answered. There's a difference. He stared at me, measuring, recalculating. Then he laughed softly, a sound with dust in it. Tomorrow, noon, he said. We'll bring a truck to start moving some items for my parents, just the guest room, no big deal. Bring whoever you like, I said, but don't bring assumption. His eyebrows rose. Is that a threat? It's a boundary, I said. They left, carrying their certainty like luggage. I stood in the doorway and watched their taillights pool red at the stop sign, then fade. The yard listened with me. The jasmine gave a low, sweet exhale. Over the fence, a neighbor's wind chimes found a simple, patient song. I checked the recorder. The tiny light winked once like a star caught in a jar. I labeled the SD card with a piece of masking tape. 6 pieces. Evidence isn't drama. It's weight. It's the kind of silence that makes a courtroom lean forward. Night came clear and suddenly cold. I stretched the garden hose across the lawn just to feel something obey. When I turned the spigot, water spun into an arc, silver under the porch light, and fell exactly where I aimed. I breathed with it, steady, deliberate, the way you breathe before you lift something heavier than grief. I locked the doors, set the mug in the sink, and stood under the kitchen clock as the minute hand clicked to 11:59. The house held. I held with it. Somewhere, boxes were being taped, plans rehearsed, a truck scheduled for noon. I whispered to the dark wood, I'm ready. But am I prepared for the moment when their voices fill these rooms tomorrow? Am I ready for the sound of wheels on my floorboards? And what if the first thing they try to move is the part of me that refuses to move? If you'd like to support the channel, a simple subscribe and like goes a long way. Thank you for being here. I pretended to nap upstairs the next afternoon. The house settled into its small, ordinary noises, pipes ticking, the furnace sighing, a car idling faintly down the street. From the landing I could hear them below. Brad's voice easy, Sarah's quieter, the kind of conversation people have when they believe the door is closed and the world is theirs to shape. Like I said, Brad was saying, we just need a doctor's note. Fake a mild cognitive issue and the paperwork handles itself. The sale clears in 3 weeks. The money goes to a holding account we redistribute as needed. I don't like this, Brad, Sarah answered, every syllable edged with fear. What if he finds out? What if... He's old, Brad cut in sharply. He forgets. He won't remember signing anything. Trust me, I know people. This is how it works. The words hit me like cold water. I lay perfectly still until the conversation blurred into the background hum of the house. My heartbeat slowed to the rhythm of the roof rafters. The jasmine outside pressed its sweet face to the window as if to listen too. Then the sound of Sarah bending forward, her whisper hardly more than a thread. But a fake diagnosis. Brad's voice dropped, clinical, efficient. Legal pathways exist. Guardianship petitions, a physician's affidavit, a clerk who files the motion. We give them a reason, the court does the rest. No one blames family for wanting what's best. I climbed down the stairs. Each step sounded like a metronome, slow, deliberate, each one announcing me. They turned as I reached the bottom, Brad's confidence cracking into something thin, Sarah's face collapsing into white shock. You came early, Brad stammered. He looked like a man whose scaffolding had been removed suddenly. I came when the story got interesting, I said. Continue, please. I don't want to miss the ending. Brad swallowed. Dad, you misunderstand. Misunderstand? I echoed. You planned to swap my life for an escrow account. You called a physician to lie. You arranged a sale in secret. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Brad, I'm so sorry. I heard everything, I said, and I set my phone on the kitchen island. A small recorder blinked a steady red. It had been capturing the entire conversation for hours. Brad looked at the device as if it were a coiled snake. I can explain. Explain, I invited. Start with why you think a man's memories are currency. He opened his mouth, closed it, then forced a laugh that came out like a cough. We thought it's complicated. We owe money. We thought this was the easiest way. Easiest for whom, I asked. You, your parents, or your ledger? He named figures like men name their tools, $50,000 to clear credit cards, $25,000 for back taxes, a chunk to a contractor who needed to get paid. Numbers tumbled out, all of them mundane and brutal. The household clock ticked them into proof. You're playing with felony, I said. Fraud, coercion, attempted financial exploitation of an elder. Brad flinched. We were going to pay it back. We didn't want to hurt you. Maybe you didn't want to hurt me, Brad, I said, but you wanted to rob what I have left. Sarah sobbed softly. Her shoulders shook like a child's. I thought it was the only way out of the debt, she said. He promised stability. I didn't think. You didn't think about me as a person, I said. You thought of me as a ledger entry. Silence fell again, heavy and thick. The kettle boiled unnoticed, then clicked off. The afternoon light slid toward the kitchen floor in a long, sharp blade. I stood and walked to the mantel, took down Anne's framed photograph and set it on the island between us. This house is not a bank, I said. It is not collateral. It is memory and bones and a promise made to a woman who trusted me with her life. You can put a price on wooden shingles, but you cannot price the sound of your daughter's laugh when she was 8. Brad's face crumpled. For a moment I thought he might fall to his knees and apologize like a penitent. Instead he opened his mouth and tried a different tactic, practicality as armor. We can handle the court, he said. We can get this done. There are templates. We don't even need to change the deed if we get guardianship. You think the law is that porous, I said coldly. The law has teeth when it's fed truth. You feed it lies and it bites back, with force. He looked at Sarah, uncertain. She met my eyes then, and the weight of it pulled her under. I was scared, she whispered. I was so scared. I felt a fracture somewhere in my chest where anger and sorrow met. I could press charges. I could call Harding, file the recordings, the bank alerts, every log visit, every text. I could make their scheme a public thing that would follow them for years. Or I could do something slower, teach them the cost of what they'd tried to take. Go, I said finally. Pack what dignity you have left and leave my porch. If I catch a moving truck here tomorrow without a court order signed in open court and delivered to me personally, I will call the police, the prosecutor, and the probate clerk. I will press every available charge. Brad rose, trembling. Sarah reached for him, and he stepped away, as if drawn to a cliff and scared to fall. He muttered, "This isn't over." And they left, the screen door slamming with the thin, decisive sound of possibility closing. When the house quieted, I pressed the play button on my recorder and listened to the evidence, a mosaic of their greed, stitched with their excuses. The voice of a man I once trusted as family had become a recorded confession. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table and looked at Anne's photo, thinking of vows and of small promises that proved themselves day by day. I thought of the law and of the slow, terrible ways families break. I thought, too, of mercy. Maybe there was a path that kept me whole and also preserved a piece of Sarah. If the law is a blade, how sharp should it be when cutting those you once loved? I opened the safe. The smell of old paper and cold metal rose up like a memory. A dark green folder with embossed letters, Rocky Mountain Trust Company. I ran my fingers over the numbers written on the tab, 1989A, Sarah's birth year and the initial of Anne. 5 years earlier, I had signed the deed into an irrevocable trust. The document sat sealed and legal, a line drawn in ink that no casual hand could erase. Today was the day to bring those protections forward, lifetime residence rights, anti-coercion clauses, and authorization for the trustee to initiate legal action if there were signs of elder exploitation. At the bank branch on 17th Street, I signed a fraud alert form and watched the clerk's screen blink green as the system logged my request. The printer hummed and spat out a slip with a case code. I stapled a copy of the trust to my affidavit and asked the teller to flag any title transfer requests. The paper read like armor, small, bureaucratic, invulnerable to a casual lie. The ticket number felt like a talisman, NB 842113. Harding called as I stepped out of the bank. Her voice was crisp, businesslike. I filed reports with Denver Police and Adult Protective Services. We submitted your recordings and a timeline of visits. They'll open a case and assign an investigator. Good, I said. What about immediate motions? Temporary guardianship. Keep the cognitive evaluation at St. Luke's tomorrow at 9 a.m. Get your MOCA on record. 26 or above strengthens our position. Document daily activity, receipts, meds, neighbor statements. If a moving truck shows up, do not physically block it. Let them approach the doorstep. We need documented refusals and witnesses, not a brawl. If Brad escalates, we file for a protective order and criminal referral. I'll be there at 9, I said. I'll remember every question. Good, I've alerted the county clerk. Don't engage Brad alone. The mountain wind pushed damp air across my porch as I drove home. The jasmine bowed under droplets. I placed the green folder on the nightstand beside the bed, the weight of paper strangely reassuring. The trust was not a weapon. It was a boundary written in legal prose. I smoothed the corners with the heel of my hand as if flattening a map. Harding had given me a list. Probate Division at 1432 County Center Drive, the Adult Protective Services intake number, the District Attorney's intake email, the court clerk's hours, 9 o'clock a.m. to 4 o'clock p.m., room 210. I made copies, deed pages, tax receipts, furnace service $289 on November 12th, county tax payment $4,862 on April 1st, screen captures of Brad's texts mentioning urgent sale and quick closing. The receipts and bills, mundane, stubborn things, became armor. The more ordinary the proof, the stronger our case. At the kitchen island, I left a neat, handwritten note. Evidence collected. Do not move items without a court order. The handwriting felt ceremonial, a small witness pinned to a table. I thought of Anne's looping script and felt her absence like a draft in a closed room. That night I slept with the folder under my pillow and rehearsed the morning in my head. The drive to St. Luke's Memory Clinic, the beige waiting room, the receptionist's badge reading Intake, Room B, the sterile odor, the clipboard with the MOCA prompts, draw a clock, repeat words, name animals. I practiced the numbers that mattered, my social, my address, the year Anne died, the price I paid for this house and the taxes I'd filed. Precision is a kind of defense. I thought of the trustee clause, the neutral party standing between me and those who would exploit me. It felt oddly like a sentinel placed on a gate. The trustee's authority would prevent any transfer of title or sale without due process. The irrevocable trust had been my quiet, future-minded act 5 years ago, a move I made when love still meant protecting what she could not. Before sleep, I set a small recorder on top of the folder. Its red light blinked a steady heartbeat in the dark. The house settled with the ordinary creaks and sighs that make up the sound of living. Far beyond, a siren swelled and faded. In the hush, I thought how the night before battle never truly sleeps. There's always a rustle, a last-minute note, a held breath. I felt the folder like a promise against my chest. If the night is the last quiet before a storm, what will I do when the first truck's wheels scrape my driveway? If you're still here with me, thank you. It means the story is speaking to you. Feel free to subscribe and let me know the time where you are right now. I'd love to see the distance between us. 9 a.m. The air was sharp and clean, the kind of Colorado morning that cuts through bone. A 20-foot U-Haul rumbled up the gravel drive, brakes hissing, tires crunching over loose stone. The sunlight caught the metal sides, turning them into a brief, blinding mirror. Brad stepped out in a gray jacket and dark sunglasses, his smile stretched but hollow. 2 movers followed, pushing dollies stacked with cardboard boxes sealed with bright orange tape. The sound of the wheels scraping the pavement was steady, practical, merciless. I waited on the porch holding a printed notice, the trust's cease and desist letter, and a temporary injunction prohibiting any sale, rental, or alteration of locks. Across the street, Officer Ramirez stood near his cruiser, observing as part of a civil standby. His stance was neutral, hand near the radio, ready but relaxed. The sparrows on the roof chattered over the silence like gossipers who sensed something human about to break. Brad lifted a hand in mock greeting. "Dad, what are you doing up there? Move aside, we need to get the boxes in." "You've got the wrong door," I said evenly. This is the property of the Rocky Mountain Trust. I'm merely its lifetime resident. He laughed once, sharp. Don't start that nonsense. My parents move in today. I stepped down one stair, the notice crisp in my hand. Then you'd better read this. Any attempt to enter is trespassing under Civil Code 184504. Everything you do here is being recorded. He glanced toward Ramirez. The officer gave him a slow, expectant nod. No threat, just acknowledgement of jurisdiction. Brad's posture shifted. The mover stopped mid-stride, boxes suspended in indecision. Officer, Brad said, his voice strained, this is a family matter. Ramirez answered calmly, Sir, the moment a resident refuses entry, it becomes a property matter. You proceed. It's trespass. I'm family, Brad snapped. Family, I said, is not an access card. The wind picked up. A dry leaf slid across the porch steps, spinning once before disappearing under the truck. One of the movers cleared his throat. You want us to unload, or... Brad waved him off, irritation flaring. Wait in the truck. He turned to me. You're humiliating yourself. No, I said, I'm protecting what's mine and what's legal. He ripped off his sunglasses. His eyes were bloodshot, defiant. You think this paper protects you? Courts can change. Judges can be convinced. Then convince one, I said, but until then, this paper is law. Sarah arrived moments later, stepping out of her car with a face that had forgotten how to smile. Brad, please, she said softly. Just stop. Her voice cracked in the cold air. This isn't worth it. Brad ignored her. They're coming in, Sarah. It's done. She looked at me, her eyes full of apology. Dad, what did you do? I didn't do anything, I said. I prepared. I handed her a copy of the letter. Read it, every line. Her fingers shook as she scanned the text. Irrevocable trust. Lifetime tenancy. Unauthorized occupancy prohibited. Each sentence pressed color out of her face. Ramirez shifted his weight. Sir, he told Brad, I need you to step back from the property line. If you continue, I'll have to write it up. Brad's composure cracked. You don't understand. He's manipulating you all. I cut him off quietly. Brad, you tried to declare me incompetent. Yet here you are, standing on a sidewalk, arguing with a legal document that outsmarts you. His jaw clenched. You'll regret this. I doubt it, I said. Regret belongs to those who run out of options. He stared at me for a long moment, then looked at Sarah. Get in the car. She didn't move. Sarah, he said louder, voice shaking. Now. She took a slow step back, but didn't join him. Brad, she whispered, I think this is over. The movers exchanged glances, then started rolling their dollies back toward the truck. The echo of rubber wheels against the gravel sounded like retreat. Ramirez watched them go, then nodded once at me, professional courtesy in the shape of silence. The U-Haul door slammed shut, reverberating through the street. Brad climbed into the driver's seat, slammed it again harder, and gunned the engine. The truck reversed too fast, scattering stones behind it. When it turned the corner, only a faint trail of dust remained. Ramirez approached the porch. You all right, Mr. Cunningham? I am, I said, and thank you for standing by. Just doing my job, he replied, tapping his notebook. You got everything on record? Every second, I said, audio and visual. Good, he said. Then if they come back, it's not a discussion anymore, it's evidence. He walked back to his cruiser and drove off slowly, leaving the air still again. The birds returned to the roof, chattering about nothing. I looked down at the porch step where the leaf had landed and crumbled. The sunlight had softened, turning the house gold. I folded the injunction back into its envelope and tucked it inside my jacket. The wood beneath my feet felt solid, alive mine. Inside, the clock chimed 10 times, measured, indifferent. I thought of all the lines people cross because they think they're entitled, and how it takes a uniform, a badge, or a printed signature to make them see the borders that love should have taught them long ago. Why is it that some only recognize boundaries when there's a witness in blue? Blue. The courthouse smelled of paper, dust, and recycled air. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Cold, indifferent, too white. Brad's petition for emergency guardianship had moved fast, but not faster than us. By 2:15 p.m., we were already seated inside courtroom 4B of the Denver County Courthouse. The seal of the state gleamed behind the bench, brass and heavy. My tie felt too tight, but my pulse was steady. Harding stood beside me, calm as winter glass. Judge Reynolds adjusted his glasses, flipping through the thick folder before him. Case number 23P1147, petition for temporary guardianship under Title 15-14-312. Parties present. Petitioner Brad Miller, his attorney said, voice too smooth. Respondent Ellis Cunningham, represented by counsel, Harding answered. The judge nodded once. Proceed. Brad's lawyer started first, trying for sympathy. Your Honor, my client's father-in-law has exhibited increasing signs of cognitive decline. There are financial safety concerns, forgetfulness, questionable decisions. Harding cut in. Your Honor, Mr. Cunningham took a Montreal cognitive assessment this morning. He scored 28 out of 30. The ink on the doctor's signature is still drying. Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Where's the documentation? She handed it forward, along with the stamped evaluation from St. Luke's Memory Clinic. The clerk took it, handed it to the judge. Paper rustled. Time slowed. Reynolds scanned it once, twice, and set it down carefully. Mr. Cunningham, he said, how do you feel today? I met his eyes. Sharp enough to remember that the bottle of Merlot I opened last week cost $39. Sharp enough to recall my wife passed away on February 18th. My safe code is 1989A. And sharp enough to remember Brad said the words, they move in tomorrow. The words hung in the air. The silence that followed was the kind that carried weight. Brad shifted in his seat, face flushed. He memorized that, he barked. He's rehearsing. The judge's gavel struck once. Quiet. Harding pressed the next button on the small playback device. From its tiny speaker came Brad's voice. Perfectly clear, perfectly damning. We just need a fake Alzheimer's diagnosis. The money from the sale clears in 3 weeks. The courtroom seemed to shrink. Even the fluorescent lights felt closer, colder. Brad's attorney paled. Sarah sat in the back row, hands pressed over her mouth. Harding handed over printed emails next. These are correspondence between the petitioner and a Mr. Mark Dillard at Front Range Realty, she said. It includes a house valuation of $950,000 with a 3% commission and a note offering 1% kickback if the deal closes in under 3 weeks. Judge Reynolds flipped through the pages, his brow tightening. Mr. Miller, he said, do you dispute authorship? Brad swallowed hard. Those were hypothetical. The judge leaned forward. Hypothetical fraud, Mr. Miller? Brad's lawyer intervened weakly. Your Honor, context, Reynolds interrupted, is precisely what's on tape. The room smelled of toner and tension. A printer hummed softly in some other office down the hall, an indifferent sound to contrast the unraveling in front of us. Mr. Cunningham, the judge said again, his tone softening. You are of sound mind, sir. I see no basis for this petition. In fact, he paused, eyes narrowing at Brad. This court is forwarding documentation to the district attorney's office for review under elder abuse and attempted financial exploitation statutes. Harding nodded once. Brad's attorney lowered his eyes. Sarah wept silently in the back, a small sound that barely reached me. The judge raised the gavel. The petition for guardianship is denied. The respondent retains full control of his estate and residence. This court recommends the petitioner seek counsel, criminal, not civil. The gavel came down once, firm and final. The sound cracked like thunder in a dry canyon, short, loud, and undeniable. Brad stood frozen, his face collapsing into disbelief. You can't, he started. The bailiff stepped forward. Court is adjourned. People stood, paper shuffled. The room filled again with human noise, that strange mixture of relief and humiliation. Harding gathered her files, her voice low. It's done, she said. They'll open a criminal review within 48 hours. I nodded. My hands were steady. Justice doesn't need to shout, I said. It just needs to echo. As we stepped into the hallway, the sound of the courthouse returned, the clicking heels, the buzz of lights, the whisper of lives intersecting. Brad slumped against the wall, Sarah beside him, her tears streaking lines through her makeup. I almost stopped. Almost. She looked up. Dad, I'm sorry. I wanted to tell her that apologies don't fix fractures. They just stop the bleeding long enough to heal. But the words wouldn't come. I gave her a nod instead, small, human, tired. Outside, the wind hit sharp against my face. The courthouse flag flapped hard in the mountain gust. Harding shook my hand. You handled yourself perfectly, she said. Not perfectly, I replied, just honestly. As she walked away, I turned back to look at the courthouse steps. The gray stone, the carved seal, the cold glass doors reflecting the sky. Justice, I thought, isn't loud. It's steady. It's a heartbeat in a silent room. And yet I wondered, why does justice always sound brightest in the coldest rooms? Let's take a brief pause here. If the story has kept you this far, please subscribe. and share the time zone you're watching from in the comments. It reminds me that we're connected, even in silence. She came alone after midnight, rain as thin as breath, combing the porch. Her coat was soaked, hair stuck to her cheeks, eyes swollen red. When I opened the door, the house exhaled warm air around her like a blanket it wasn't sure she deserved. "Dad," she whispered, voice breaking, "I'm scared. I was wrong." "Where were you?" I asked, stepping aside so the rain wouldn't reach the floor. "When they tried to push me out of my house with paperwork." She didn't answer. She set her phone on the table with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. Message threads lit the screen. Timestamps, emojis that felt obscene against the content. There were DocuSign emails, a string of reminders, IP logs, an e-consent stamp beside her name, initials in neat blue bubbles. Each file opened like a blade. "Brad said my credit was already ruined," she murmured. "He showed me my score, 542. He said the only way to climb out was to leverage this house. He said it was normal. Families do it all the time." Her breath trembled. "He made me e-sign a loan application in his friend's office. I didn't read half of it." "Did he threaten you?" I asked. Her eyes lifted. "Not with words he'd put in writing. He said if I didn't help, he'd tell everyone I forged his signature on a car lease. He said he'd make it look like I stole from him." I swiped through the document slowly, a capacity-concerned draft letter, a template affidavit for guardianship, a bullet list titled "Closing in 21 days." There were line items that made my stomach knot. Inspection waiver, commission split 3% with a side note 1% back to M. I recognized the shape of a trap, neat, administrative, deadly. "Sarah," I said quietly, "are you willing to cooperate?" She nodded. "Yes." "Not halfway," I said, "all the way. Sworn statements, screenshots, the truth, where it hurts." She flinched and then nodded again, harder. "All the way." I made tea because hands need something to do when hearts don't. The kettle sputtered. The jasmine in the rain outside sent sweetness through the screen, a perfume for broken things. She held the mug with both hands as if heat could teach her to stop shaking. We sat at the kitchen table where birthdays and algebra once lived. I opened a fresh legal pad. "Tell me everything. Start with the day you first signed something you didn't read." She talked in strips, and I taped them together. The afternoon at a co-working suite off Spear, the notary who barely looked up. Brad pacing, texting a contact labeled M Valuations. The amounts, the dates, the promises, the pressure. Each detail fell into place like a nail being driven. When grief tried to break through her voice, I kept her moving. "Next," I said gently. "Then what happened?" She spoke until there was nothing left but the rain and the soft whistle of the kettle agreeing we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. At 8:10 a.m., with the sky the color of unpolished silver, I called Harding. "She'll cooperate," I said. "We have messages, DocuSign trails, the lot." "Bring her in," Harding answered. "We'll draft an affidavit, dates, facts, exhibits. We'll notarize. Then we file with the state real estate regulator and the district attorney's intake. Truth won't fix everything, but it will stop the bleeding." By 9:30, we were in Harding's conference room, Sarah wrapped in a dry sweater the paralegal found. The room smelled like toner and coffee that had given up. Harding listened without interruption, stopping only to clarify names and times. She spoke to Sarah the way climbers speak on a ledge, clear, exact, no extra words. "You understand," Harding said, "that cooperation means you hand over your phone, your passwords for the relevant accounts, and you sign under penalty of perjury." "I understand," Sarah said. "I want to tell it clean." We printed the affidavit, pages stamped and numbered. Exhibit A, text thread from March 11th. Exhibit B, DocuSign envelope ID. Exhibit C, screenshot of closing in 21 days. Exhibit D, commission email, referring to 3%, and a 1-point kickback. The notary slid the stamp over the signature line. The thud of it sounded like the end of something and the beginning of something else. "Next," Harding said, "we'll forward this to the state regulator for real estate licensing and to the district attorney. Expect follow-ups, possibly a recorded interview. Keep your phone on, don't delete anything, don't contact Brad." Sarah stared at the stamp as if it were a bruise forming. "He'll hate me," she whispered. "He already traded you," I said softly, "for a percentage point." She looked at me then, really looked, and the child behind her eyes shook a little less. "I'm sorry," she said. "I betrayed you." "I know," I said. The words were heavier than they sounded. "We'll use the truth to put the fire out. After that, we'll see what can be rebuilt." We walked out into a morning rinsed clean by rain. Cars sprayed thin fans of water at each curb. Someone argued softly into a headset. A pigeon hopped like it had somewhere to be. Sarah slid her arm through mine. For 1 block, it felt like years ago, school drop-offs, spelling tests, a house that had never heard the word guardianship. Back home, I filed the new evidence with the others. Recordings, receipts, the trust packet, now Sarah's affidavit. The folder had grown thick. It felt like a spine. The house felt steadier, too, as if timbers remember courage the way they remember storms. That night, after she left for a hotel the firm arranged, I sat with Anne's photo and watched the porch light cast its thin circle. Forgiveness stood on the steps like weather, sometimes soft, sometimes brutal, always changing. I could offer it, yes, but could I live with the memory that demanded it? Can a father forgive without forgetting, or is forgetting the very thing that put us here? News travels fast in small industries. By morning, word had run through the brokerage grapevine. The regulator had issued an immediate suspension of Brad's license pending investigation. By noon, the district attorney's office floated charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted exploitation of an at-risk elder, and identity misrepresentation. None of it felt like victory. It felt like paperwork catching up to intent. Harding called me to a meeting. Small conference room, warm yellow lights, the plastic new smell of chairs that hadn't learned to creak yet. Across the table sat Brad, his attorney, a junior from the DA's office, and a probation officer who said almost nothing, just watched. A voice recorder the size of a deck of cards blinked red between us. "We're prepared to offer a plea," the DA began. "No contest to 1 count of attempted exploitation, dismissal of the rest. Conditions: restitution for respondents' legal costs, community service, 500 hours supervised, 2 years probation, and a no-contact order for 5 years with a distance of 500 meters. Violation triggers jail." Brad stared down at the polished tabletop like there was a secret in the grain he could bargain with. His attorney cleared his throat. "My client has no record. He's under financial strain. He believed he was acting in the family's interest." "In the family's interest," Harding repeated, "is not a legal defense." Brad finally looked at me. The anger was gone. What remained was ash and a kind of stunned emptiness. "You won," he said. "No one wins," I answered. "When family loses, nobody wins." He swallowed. "Could you drop the distance clause? I won't come near the house. 5 years is a long time." "No," I said. "Boundaries exist so the rest of us can keep breathing." The DA slid the printed agreement across the table. "Initial here, and sign at the bottom. You'll report to Community Corrections Monday at 8 a.m. for intake. Fees collected at signing. You'll also surrender your real estate license as part of administrative resolution. The regulator will decide on reinstatement in the future." Brad held the pen for a long beat. His hand trembled. The tip scratched the paper. Letters formed that even he didn't seem to recognize as his. The recorder kept blinking, red, 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 as if counting the beats of a heart that had nowhere better to be. "Mr. Cunningham," his attorney said, voice softer now, "would you consider mediation with your daughter?" "I will speak with Sarah when she has a therapist and a budget that is not mine," I said, "not before." The probation officer added, almost gently, "Community service placements are usually shelter kitchens, city cleanup, or elder centers. Show up on time. Keep your head down. Finish the hours." Brad nodded, eyes fixed on the contract. "I thought I could fix it," he whispered. 3 weeks and everything would be better." 3 weeks to ruin a decade, I said. "That's quite a return." He signed. The sound of pens. Harding's, the DA's, the notary's stamp filled the room in quick succession, a percussion section of finality. The file folder closed with a soft thud that felt louder than a gavel. Outside the conference room, people moved on with ordinary lives. A copier chewed paper. Someone laughed at the far end of the hall. The world did not applaud or boo. It simply continued, tireless and indifferent. We walked out together, not as a family, but as parties who had finished a transaction. At the elevator, Brad asked without meeting my eyes, "Does any of this matter to you, the service, the probation, the 5 years?" "It matters that you won't touch my doorknob," I said. "The rest is between you and the part of yourself that thought I was a solution instead of a person." He flinched as if I'd slapped him, then stepped into the elevator and stared at the closing seam of the doors like it might speak mercy if he waited long enough. The ride down took forever and an instant. In the lobby, Harding pressed the manila envelope into my hands. Certified copies, the restraining order, the restitution receipt. Numbers typed in cold ink. Legal fees reimbursed in full within 30 days, probation commencing immediately, distance restriction enforced electronically if necessary. The law has many small teeth. Today they met. I wanted quiet, I told Harding as we stepped into the street. And now you have it, she said, uneasy quiet, but quiet. I walked home under a sky the color of clean steel. The flag outside the courthouse snapped hard in the wind. On Willow Creek Road, a delivery driver missed my street and reversed carefully, the beeping steady and apologetic. Life continued adjusting itself around the edges of my story. Back in my kitchen, I set the envelope beside the green trust folder, paper on paper, boundaries layered. I poured water into the kettle and listened for the first low rumble before the boil. It sounded like a house relearning how to breathe. When justice closes the file, can a wound inside a home choose to heal? Or do some houses keep their scars like warnings carved into wood? Let's keep going. But before we do, please subscribe to the channel, and in the comments, tell me what time it is in your part of the world. It's always incredible to see how far this story reaches. The house was quiet, not empty. That's how I knew it was alive again, the kind of quiet that breathes instead of echoes. I changed the locks first, brass, shining under the morning light, clean edges, a new sound when the key turned. Then I checked the gutters, replaced 2 cracked shingles, and painted the white fence along the drive. The smell of new paint mixed with the scent of wet grass left by last night's drizzle. It smelled like a beginning that didn't need to announce itself. In the kitchen, sunlight stretched across the oak table, the same one Anne had sanded by hand 30 years ago. I wiped it clean, polished the grain until it gleamed. Then I placed my old Sumatra mandolin mug on Anne's coaster, the one with a fading blue ring in the center. The steam rose slow, curling like memory itself. Above the counter, a row of family photos glowed faintly in the light. Sarah at 8, clutching her little ukulele. Anne, eyes closed, mid-laughter. Me, younger, unaware that every perfect moment comes with an expiration date. The phone rang. Sarah's name lit the screen. Her voice was steadier than it had been in months. "Dad," she said softly, "can I come help fix up the backyard? The roses look wild in the pictures." I hesitated a second too long. "Not to make up for things," I said finally. "Just to do something right." "Right," she replied, "just to do something right." By noon she was there, same driveway she used to chalk hopscotch on. She brought pruning shears, gloves, and a paper bag of soil conditioner from Lowe's. We worked side by side, wordlessly at first. The sun pressed warm on our shoulders. The snip of shears cut through the air in steady rhythm. 1, 2, 1, 2, the sound of 2 people trying to sync a heartbeat again. She paused, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I used to hate these roses," she said. "They always had thorns." "That's how they remember not to be touched too carelessly," I said. She smiled faintly. "Guess I could have used a few thorns." The silence between us wasn't heavy. It was soil turning over, air finding its way through roots. I watched her kneel to tie back the vines, careful, deliberate. Time for once didn't feel like a thief. It felt like a witness. "Sarah," I said, voice calm, "we need clear lines this time. Money separate, decisions separate. If we build anything again, it has to stand on that." She looked at me, eyes full but not breaking. "I agree," she said. "Completely." I nodded. The wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of someone mowing 2 houses down. The world, ever indifferent, kept moving forward. We kept working until the sky burned honey gold. The new fence glowed faintly, the paint dry enough to catch light without bleeding it. The roses stood taller, pruned but alive, roots deep, petals soft and certain. She set down the shears, brushed the dirt off her knees, and looked around. "It looks smaller than I remembered," she said. "It always does when you come back as an adult," I answered. "But the light—" I pointed toward the western ridge where the sun began to slip behind the pines. "The light still falls the same." She followed my gaze, and for a moment we stood in it together. The quiet wrapped around us like a promise that didn't need to be spoken. I poured 2 glasses of water from the kitchen hose. Cold, metallic, perfect. We sat on the back steps, boots dusty, hands scratched, heart somewhere between grief and peace. She turned toward me. "Do you ever stop thinking about what happened?" she asked. "No," I said, "but I stopped letting it decide what happens next." She nodded slowly, as if learning a language she used to know. The last of the sunlight folded itself over the grass, warm and thin. The house exhaled again, its windows glinting like open eyes. In the distance, a train horn carried faintly from the edge of town. The sound stretched long, low, almost tender. I used to hate that noise. It always meant something leaving. Tonight it sounded like movement, like possibility. Maybe healing doesn't begin with forgiveness. Maybe it starts when you finally rename the boundaries that protect what's left. The last morning came quietly, like a secret the world had agreed to keep. The coffee machine hummed, slow and familiar. Steam curled into the cold Denver air, soft as breath. I opened the front door, and the chill brushed against my skin. Sharp, alive, honest. On the driveway, the Denver Post lay folded, the headline reading about a new crackdown on elder abuse. I smiled. Life, it seemed, was learning to defend its own. I brought the paper inside, set it beside my old leather notebook, and wrote one short line. Keep the house. Keep the memory. Keep your dignity. Those words had carried me farther than anger ever could. Around me, everything was still. The brick walls, the oak floors, the steady tick of the clock. I had reclaimed not just a house, but the right to breathe in it without fear. My phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. Therapy at 10 o'clock. I'm trying to be better, Dad. I stared at it for a moment, the screen glowing in the soft light. Then I whispered almost to the photograph of Anne on the mantel. She's finding her way back. For the first time in months, I exhaled without pain. Some stories don't end with fireworks or headlines. Some end with silence, the kind that feels earned. What began as deceit had become a quiet redemption, proof that justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply stays. Maybe that's what makes these family drama tales so human. Not the betrayal, but the rebuilding. Maybe that's why revenge stories rarely feel like revenge at all. They're just broken people learning how to stand again. I sipped my coffee, the taste deep and familiar, and sunlight slipped through the blinds, drawing gold lines across the table. The old oak outside rustled in the wind, a sound that felt like applause. If this story brings you comfort, feel free to subscribe and share it. Someone out there might need it too. Thank you for staying until the end. Wherever you're watching from, I hope your home feels steady, your mornings quiet, and your heart at peace. And if you're ready for another story, stay with us. The next one will remind you how courage often hides in the gentlest of choices. I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth of the room settle around me. The door behind me closed softly, not as an ending, but as a beginning. And now I'll ask you, if someone tried to claim what's yours, not your house but your peace, how would you respond? Would you fight back, or would you outlast them? Tell me in the comments. I'd like to hear how you would defend your home.